The ledger was so worn along its spine that Maria Vaughn had taken to wrapping it in a square of oilcloth each night before she set it on the shelf, treating it with the same careful reverence a church-going woman might give to her Bible. Because in the drought summer of 1878 in the high desert country of West Texas, that ledger was the only thing standing between the Slater ranch and complete ruin. She had not been asked to keep it. That was the truth of it, plain and simple, and Maria turned it over in her mind on the mornings she sat at the wide-planked table near the window with the dry wind already curling off the flats before sunrise. She had not been asked. She had simply begun. It had started 6 months prior, back in the raw January cold, when a man named Deke Holloway, who served as the ranch's hired foreman in Andrew Slater's absence, had ridden into Red Fork with a bottle of whiskey for company and come back 2 days later with neither the whiskey, nor the payroll money, nor any clear recollection of where either had gone. The hands had not been paid. The feed supplier over in Comanche Falls was owed $42. The bank note on the eastern grazing pasture was due in 6 weeks, and Deke Holloway, red-eyed and shaking at the kitchen table, could not account for a single line in the books he was supposed to have been keeping. Maria had been living in the small foreman's cabin on the edge of the Slater property since the previous autumn, when she had nowhere else to go. Her husband, Thomas Vaughn, had died of a fever the previous July, leaving her with a small mule, a trunk of clothes, 70 cents, and a debt to the Red Fork General Store that she had not been able to clear before his body was cold in the ground. She was 28 years old, dark-haired, with steady brown eyes and the kind of lean, sun-weathered face that comes from years of honest outdoor work rather than neglect. She had been a bookkeeper's daughter out of San Antonio, raised among ledgers and ink pots and the quiet satisfaction of numbers that balanced, and she could do sums in her head faster than most men could do them on paper. Andrew Slater had offered her the use of the cabin in exchange for help with cooking and mending when his regular cook, old Berta Timms, had gone to live with her daughter in Abilene. It was a practical arrangement, the kind the frontier produced regularly, without sentiment. Andrew himself had left for the northern cattle drive in September, 2 months before Maria arrived, and she had never met him. She knew him only through the objects he had left behind in the main house, a pair of worn boots by the back door, a shelf of books above the fireplace that included Shakespeare and a surveying manual, and a battered volume of Tennyson, a hat hanging on a peg near the door that was too large for any of the hands, and the signed letters from the bank that Deke Holloway kept losing under stacks of harness leather. So when she saw the books in January and understood the scope of what was going wrong, she did not ask permission from anyone, because there was no one with authority to give it. She simply sat down, uncapped the ink, sharpened a pen nib with her small folding knife, and began. The Slater Ranch ran about 400 head of longhorn cattle on 1,200 acres in the rolling Caliche Flats north of the Pecos River. It was not the biggest operation in Crockett County, but it was solid, or had been, before the drought came down hard in the spring of 1878 like a lid coming down on a pot. The grass dried to wire. The creek that fed the eastern tank dropped to a thread and then to nothing. The cattle lost condition fast, the kind of fast that made a rancher's stomach drop when he rode out in the morning, and the 3 hands who remained on the property, men named Caleb, Russ, and a young Mexican vaquero called Paco who was 19 and had been with the ranch since he was 15, did their work without complaint but with the tight, watchful expressions of men who knew the margins were thin. Maria learned their wages from the books, learned the amounts owed to the feed supplier and to the bank, learned that there was a note coming due in March on the eastern pasture that amounted to $110, a sum that might as well have been $1,000 given the current state of the ranch's income. She learned that Andrew Slater had left Deke Holloway with a modest operating fund of $300 in a locked box in the desk drawer, and that of that money, only $84 remained, and Deke could not explain the difference. She confronted Deke on the matter quietly and without accusation, sitting across the table from him in the early morning while the coffee boiled on the stove. She showed him the numbers. She asked him to account for them. He looked at the figures for a long time with the expression of a man reading a language he did not quite know, and then he told her he reckoned he had made some purchases for the ranch that he had not written down, and she told him, just as quietly, that she was going to need him to remember what those purchases were and whether they existed. 2 days later, Deke packed his bedroll and rode out of the ranch without another word, and she supposed that answered her question about the missing money well enough. After that, she was the only person on the property who could keep the books, so she kept them. She wrote to the feed supplier in Comanche Falls and negotiated the payment schedule down to installments of $12 a month, explaining the drought conditions in plain, factual language that apparently impressed the man, because he wrote back agreeing to the arrangement. She organized the remaining hands and their wages, keeping careful records. She sold 3 of the weakest cattle to a buyer passing through Red Fork before they lost any more condition, which brought in $47 that she applied directly to the bank note, reducing the March payment to something manageable if they were careful. She kept the household running on next to nothing, baking cornbread instead of buying flour bread, mending the hands' gear instead of ordering new supplies, doing the kind of patient, unflashy economizing that does not look like heroism, but holds things together all the same. The drought did not break. April came and then May, and the sky stayed the color of bleached bone and the wind blew hot from the southwest and the creek stayed dry. The cattle needed water hauled in, which Caleb and Russ did with the 2 water barrels on the flat wagon, twice a week, a full day's labor each trip. Paco rode the fences and checked for strays and did it without being asked. Maria kept the numbers. Every dollar spent, every dollar earned from the small sales she arranged when buyers passed through, every bit of feed, every repair. The ledger grew dense with her neat, slanted handwriting. She did not write to Andrew Slater. She was not sure where to write. The cattle drive had taken him north, and the last she had heard from Deke before he left was that Slater had extended the drive and was working a second season somewhere in the Colorado Territory to build up the cash reserves. There was no address. There was no reliable way to reach him. And besides, Maria had the ranch's ledger to think of, and she had her chin up and her pen moving, and she told herself there was nothing to write until there was something certain to report. June arrived, and with it a complication she had not anticipated. A man named Holt Briggs rode onto the Slater property on a Thursday afternoon when the heat was pressed down flat and white over everything, trailing 2 other riders behind him. He was a land speculator out of San Angelo, lean and overgroomed for the country he was riding through, with a silver watch chain glinting at his vest and eyes the color of dirty water. He told Maria, who met him on the porch with her hands flour-dusted from the morning's baking and her expression carefully neutral, that he had heard the Slater ranch was in financial difficulty, and that he was in a position to make a generous offer for the eastern pasture. She told him the ranch was not for sale. He smiled in the way that men like him smile, with just the front teeth and nothing behind the eyes, and told her that he understood the lady was perhaps not the one to make that decision, and that he would wait for the owner to return. She told him the owner's interests were well represented in the meantime, and that his wait would be a long and uncomfortable one if he expected a different answer. He rode off, but she did not think he was gone for good, and she was right. He came back twice more in the following weeks, each time a little less pleasant, each time bringing up the bank note, the drought, the difficulty of maintaining the herd in such conditions. She knew what he was doing. She had seen her father deal with men like this in San Antonio, men who circled a struggling business like crows above a sick animal, patient and sure of their eventual meal. She kept him off the property and she kept the books, and the 2 things were, in her mind, the same act. She was at the table on a Tuesday morning in the last week of July, the window propped open with a stick and the dry air moving over her papers, when she heard hoofbeats on the road that were not the particular rhythm of any of the three hands she knew. She looked up. Through the window she could see the road coming in from the south gate, straight and pale as a bone under the white sky, and on it was a single rider on a big bay horse, riding with the loose, easy posture of a man who had been in the saddle for a very long time and had made his peace with it. He was broad through the shoulders and wore a dark hat that was alkali-dusted along the brim, and he had the kind of unhurried forward lean of a man who knew exactly where he was going and felt something complicated about arriving there. She did not know who he was. She watched him come up the road to the yard, watched him pull up at the hitching post, and step down from the bay with the stiff, careful movement of a man whose body had been well used and needed a moment to recollect itself. He was perhaps 32 or 33, she thought, with a face that was sunburned and trail-worn, and carried in its lines the evidence of both hard weather and hard thinking. His jaw was covered in several days of dark beard. His coat was trail-dusted. He stood a moment in the yard looking at the main house, and something in his face shifted, something that was not quite relief and not quite pain but carried the texture of both. Then he noticed her in the window. He pushed his hat back from his forehead and looked at her with open, uncomplicated surprise. Maria rose from the table and went to the door and opened it and stepped out onto the porch, her hands still holding the pen she had been using when she looked up. He was standing in the yard 10 feet from her. Up close his eyes were a particular shade of gray-green that she had not been able to determine from inside, and they were fixed on her with an expression of complete bewilderment that she might have found amusing under other circumstances. He said, "Who are you?" His voice was level and low, not unkind, genuinely asking. It was the voice of a man who had returned to a place that was his own and found it entirely other than he had left it, and who wanted an honest answer before he drew any conclusions. She looked at him steadily and said, "My name is Maria Vaughn. I am keeping house and managing the ranch books while you are away." A pause. He looked at her, then at the porch, then back at her. He said, "I am Andrew Slater. This is my ranch." She said, "I know." Another pause. The bay horse dropped its head and blew dust from its nostrils. Somewhere behind the barn, a mockingbird made 3 short notes and went quiet. He said, "How long have you been here?" She said, "Since October." "Working for your ranch since January when Mr. Holloway left." His expression did something complicated. He said, "Deke left," she said. "He did." He looked at the ledger under her arm, which she had brought with her from the table without thinking about it. He said, "Are those my books?" She said, "They are." He said, "May I come inside?" She stepped back and held the door, and he walked past her into the main house, ducking slightly under the low door frame, even though he did not need to, an old habit perhaps, and she followed him in. He stood in the middle of the front room and looked at it for a moment the way a man looks at something he has been carrying in his memory and needs to reconcile with the reality. The room was clean. The fireplace was swept. The shelf of books was dusted. On the table near the window, the papers she had been working on were arranged in a precise order, held in place by a smooth piece of sandstone she used as a paperweight. He took off his hat and held it in his hands and said, quietly, almost to himself, "The place looks better than I left it." Maria said, "Please sit down. I will bring you coffee." He sat, still holding his hat, and she went to the kitchen and poured coffee from the pot that was always on the stove during the working day and brought it back to him. He took it with both hands and drank, and she sat down across the table from him and opened the ledger to the current page and turned it to face him. She said, "You should know where things stand." He looked at her. Then he looked at the ledger. Then slowly he leaned forward and began to read. She watched him read. She watched his expression move through what she had written, the careful accounting of every month since January, the notation of Deke Holloway's departure, the letter to the feed supplier, the cattle sales, the bank payments, the water hauling costs, the wages paid, the things bought and the things not bought, and the reasons for each decision recorded in her precise, clear hand. She watched him reach the March page where she had noted the banknote payment and the shortfall she had covered by selling the 3-week cattle, and she saw his jaw tighten. She watched him reach the May pages where she had recorded Holt Briggs's 3 visits and her responses, and she saw his eyes go still and sharp. She watched him reach the current page, which recorded this very morning's work, the column of figures she had been adding when she looked up and saw him on the road. He read for a long time without speaking. She did not try to fill the silence. When he looked up, his face was doing something she could not entirely name. There was something in it that was rawer than she had expected. He said, "You did all of this." She said, "Yes," he said, "without being asked." She said, "There was no one to ask." He looked at the ledger again. He said, "You kept the Eastern pasture." She said, "The banknote is current. I arranged a payment plan. Briggs will not get it." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "Who is she?" She looked at him. He said, "I'm sorry. I mean, who are you, in terms of how you came to be here?" "Berta was the only woman on this property when I left." So she told him, simply and without decoration. Her father's work in San Antonio, her marriage to Thomas Vaughn, Thomas's death the previous summer. The arrangement Deke Holloway had offered her, use of the cabin for cooking and mending, her arrival in October, the state of the books when she had first looked at them in January. She kept her voice even and her hand still on the table because she had learned that the best way to be believed was to tell a thing plainly and let it carry its own weight. Andrew Slater listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a bit, and then he said, "I am sorry about your husband." She said, "Thank you," he said, "and I owe you a great deal." She said, "You owe me nothing. I had use of the cabin and there was work that needed doing. The accounts will show what was spent and what was earned, and you can verify every line." He said quietly, "I believe you." It was a simple thing to say, but something in the way he said it, without qualification and without condescension, made her straighten slightly in her chair. He rubbed the back of his neck with one hand. He said, "I should go see the herd. And the hands, are Caleb and Russ still on?" She said, "They are. And Paco." He said, "Good." He rose and then he paused. He looked at her again with that gray-green gaze that was direct in the way of a man who had been alone for a long time and had forgotten to be indirect. He said, "Mrs. Vaughn, the arrangement you had with Deke, the cabin and the cooking, if it suits you to remain, I would like you to continue. Particularly with the books, if you are willing, I can pay you properly." She looked at him for a moment. There was nothing in the offer that was anything other than practical, but she noticed the care with which he had said it, the deliberate courtesy of giving her the choice, the lack of assumption. She said, "It suits me." He nodded once, put his hat back on, and went out. She sat for a moment at the table in the quiet house and listened to his boots on the porch steps, and then she picked up her pen and found her place in the column of figures and kept working. He came back from the herd late in the afternoon with Caleb walking beside his horse, both of them talking in the low, practical shorthand of men who know the same land well. She heard them in the yard and looked out the window. Caleb's face held an expression she had not seen on it before, something approaching relief, and she understood the weight that the hands had been carrying, doing their work faithfully without a figure of authority on the property, trusting Maria because she was there and competent, and because there was no one else. She made supper that evening for the hands and for Andrew, the way she always did, salt pork and beans and cornbread with the last of the week's butter. Andrew came to the table clean-shaven, having used the wash basin in the back room, wearing a fresh shirt that was still travel-wrinkled but better than what he had arrived in. He sat at the head of the table where no one had sat since October, and the table felt different with him there, more correctly weighted, as if the room had been waiting for its balance to be restored. The hands were different too. Caleb talked more than usual, with the slight animation of a man relieved of a responsibility that had been weighing on him. Russ was quieter but kept glancing at Andrew with a kind of satisfaction. Paco sat straight and listened with the careful attention he always brought to things, but the tightness around his eyes was gone. Andrew asked good questions. He asked about the cattle, which pastures had held water and which had not, whether the fence on the south boundary had been repaired, how the bay horse had handled the last 100 miles of the drive back. He listened to the answers seriously. He complimented the cornbread. He did not make a speech or a declaration. He simply came back to his table and sat at it and was present, and Maria found herself observing him with a quiet, cautious attention. After supper, when the hands had gone to the bunkhouse and the dishes were cleared, Andrew remained at the table with his coffee and the ledger open in front of him, running through the pages again more slowly this time, and Maria sat at the far end of the table with the month's supply list she was working through. He said, without looking up, "The deal you made with Comanche Falls, $12 a month. How did you get him down to that?" She said, "I explained the drought conditions with specific reference to the rainfall records I found in your desk drawer, and I noted that the alternative to a flexible payment arrangement was a defaulted account, which would serve neither of us." He is a businessman, he understood. A small silence. He said, "That's well done," she said. "It seemed logical." He turned a page in the ledger. He said, "Briggs came back twice after the first time," she said. 3 visits in total. The last was in late June. He said, "He'll come back again." She said, "Yes, I expect so, particularly now that he knows the owner has returned. He may think you more receptive than I was." Andrew looked up then. Something crossed his face that might have been the beginning of amusement, though it was brief and contained. He said, "Did he give you trouble?" She said, "Nothing I could not manage. He was unpleasant, but he was not dangerous. He knew I had records of all 3 visits and that anything out of order would be documented." Andrew was quiet for a moment. Then he said simply, "He is not getting that pasture." She said, "No." He looked at her across the length of the table with that direct gaze and then nodded, once as if they had made an agreement, and went back to the ledger. The days that followed fell into a new rhythm. The drought continued, relentless and remorseless, the sky staying a burning pale blue through August with no promise of clouds. The cattle continued to lose condition, and the water hauling continued twice a week. But with Andrew back on the property, there was a different quality to the work. Decisions that had been Maria's to make alone were now made together, at the table in the evenings or in the yard in the morning, with the practical, unsentimental directness of 2 people who both understood the numbers and both cared about the outcome. He deferred to her on the accounting without making a performance of it, accepting her figures and her projections with the matter-of-fact respect of a man who recognized competence when it was in front of him, and had no need to diminish it. She learned that he had extended the drive north because the previous year's beef prices had dropped, and he had gambled on the Colorado market, a gamble that had partly paid off, enough to bring back $600 in cash that he had sewn into the lining of his saddlebag and carried home with him like a prayer. When he laid the money on the table that first evening, stacking the notes in front of her for accounting purposes, she had looked at it and then at him and said, "That changes things considerably." He had said, "That's why I stayed for it." She entered the amount in the ledger in her neat hand and showed him what it meant for the bank note, for the feed payments, for the operating margin going forward. He followed her figures closely, asking questions that were specific and intelligent, understanding the numbers quickly once he saw how she had organized them. She realized he was not enumerate. He simply had not had the formal training she had, and the difference between them was practice and method rather than capacity. They worked well together. That was the plain fact of it, the one she was most careful not to dwell on too long when she was alone in the cabin at night with the dry wind moving outside and the coyotes calling in the distance. It was in the first week of August that he came back from the South Range looking troubled, and she knew before he spoke that it was something serious because his face had the closed, deliberate look of a man containing news he needed to think through before he released it. He took off his hat and sat down and told her that 3 of the herd on the South Range were sick, showing the signs of Texas fever, the tick-borne illness that could run through a cattle herd like a grass fire given the right conditions. He had seen it once before, years ago on a neighbor's place, and he had not forgotten the speed of it. She set down her pen. She said, "How many head are on the South Range?" He said, "63. She said, "What do you need?" He told her. They needed to separate the sick animals immediately, burn the pasture the sick cattle had been on to clear the ticks, and treat the remaining animals with the sulfur dip used in cattle operations that had dealt with this before. The dip cost money. Moving 60 cattle quickly required all hands working at once. The burning had to be controlled carefully, or they would lose more grass than they could afford to in a drought. She had the cost of the sulfur dip figured and noted before he finished talking. She showed him the number. They had the money. They could do it. He looked at her for a moment and said, "How do you do that so fast?" She said, "My father ran a mercantile and a small lending office. I grew up with numbers." He said, "You did not learn this from a husband." It was not a question, not exactly. She looked at him. He met her eyes steadily, not apologetically, just honestly. She said, "Thomas was a good man. He was not a numbers man." Andrew said, "I am sorry he is gone." She said, "So am I." She paused. "He deserved better than the summer took from him." He nodded. There was nothing more to say about it, and neither of them tried to say more. They moved on the fever immediately. All three hands and Andrew worked the South Range the next morning, separating the sick animals in the close heat, the cattle moving slowly and the men slower in the sun. Maria rode out that morning too, on the small mule she owned, because she had been riding that range for 6 months and knew its geography as well as anyone on the property, and she helped direct the movement of the herd from the east flank while the men worked the west. Andrew watched her do it with an expression she felt rather than saw from across the moving cattle, and she kept her eyes on the work. The burning of the south pasture was done carefully, a controlled line burn in the early morning before the wind picked up, with Caleb and Russ managing the back lines while Andrew and Paco worked the front. Maria stood at the edge of the yard and watched the smoke rise orange against the white sky, and she did not let herself think about what it meant in terms of grazing capacity, because she had already done that calculation, and there was nothing to be gained by doing it twice. Holt Briggs appeared again at the end of that same week, riding in at mid-morning with only one rider behind him this time, and this time he had a written offer in his coat pocket that he handed to Maria on the porch before he realized she was not alone. Andrew came around the corner of the barn at that moment, having heard the hoofbeats, and the expression on Briggs's face when he saw him was something between surprise and recalculation. Andrew looked at the paper in Maria's hand. He looked at Briggs. He said in a voice that was very calm, "I'll save you the time. The answer is no." Briggs smiled the front-tooth smile and went through his patter about the drought and the market and the reasonable terms of the offer, and Andrew let him finish, and then said again with the same absolute calm, "No." Briggs looked at Maria, as if hoping she might offer a different perspective. She looked back at him with the same expression she had been giving him for 2 months, steady and unimpressed, and he seemed to understand that there was nothing for him here. He left. Andrew watched him go until the dust settled back on the road, and then he turned to Maria and said, "He won't give up that easily," she said. "I know, but he cannot force a sale. As long as the banknote is current, his leverage is nothing." Andrew looked at her with that direct gaze again and said, "As long as the banknote is current because of you," she said. "As long as the banknote is current." He almost smiled. It was close enough to count. She carried that almost smile back to the cabin with her that evening, and it sat with her longer than she thought it should. And she lay in the dark and listened to the dry wind and told herself firmly to be sensible, because she had been on this property for the better part of a year, and she had managed everything with sense, and she was not going to stop now. But things were changing between them, and she was not so proud or so close to herself that she could pretend they were not. It happened in the small ways first, the way things do when two people live and work in close proximity, and both are too honest to play games. He brought her coffee in the mornings without being asked, setting it quietly beside her papers when she was already at the table before he went out to the yard. She noticed he had started leaving the ranch survey maps on the table, so she would have them to hand if she needed to reference land boundaries in her accounting. When Paco's horse threw a shoe and the young man was embarrassed about the cost of the farrier's visit, it was Maria who noted it in the books without comment and Andrew who caught her eye over Paco's head and gave a small nod. They talked in the evenings. Properly talked, not just about the ranch, though the ranch was always the groundwork of their conversation, the way the land is the groundwork under everything else. He told her about the cattle drives, the long monotony of them and the occasional chaos, the storms on the high plains, and the particular quality of the sky in Colorado in the autumn. She told him about San Antonio, her father's office, the smell of ink and sawdust that she associated with her childhood. He asked about her father with the attention of a man who is genuinely curious about the person in front of him rather than just keeping conversation, and she found herself telling him more than she had intended, about the bookkeeping lessons that had been as natural as breathing, about her father's death when she was 22, about the marriage to Thomas that had been warm and honest if not passionate, about the fever that had taken him and the hard months after. He listened the way he read the ledger, carefully and completely. He did not offer comfort she had not asked for or reassurances that glossed over the difficulty of what she had been through. He simply received what she told him and held it in the way that felt like respect, and she found that more sustaining than she had expected. He did not talk about his own personal history easily. She learned it in pieces. A family in Kentucky, a father who had been a cavalryman in the war. He himself had come west at 20 after the war had reshaped the country into something his family had not expected, and the land in Kentucky had been divided and sold, and there was nothing to stay for. He had worked other men's cattle for 3 years, saving, learning the land, and then he had found this parcel in Crockett County and put what he had into it. He was 33 years old. He had been on this land for 8 years. It was the thing most like a home he had ever built, he said, one evening in a tone that was not sentimental but was honest. And then he was quiet and she understood the weight he was carrying, coming back to find it diminished by drought and the negligence of the man he had trusted, and finding it also preserved by someone he had never met. She said quietly, "It is still yours." He looked at her. He said, "Yes, it is." A pause. "Because of you." She said, "Because of the work of everyone on this property." He said, "You know what I mean." She looked at the table. She said, "I did what needed doing, that is all." He said, "That is never all. Most people don't do what needs doing. They wait for permission, or they wait for someone else, or they wait for the right moment and the moment passes." He paused. He said, "You did not wait." She met his eyes. Something moved in the air between them that was larger than the conversation, something that had been gathering for weeks, and she felt the pull of it clearly enough that she looked away first. She said, "It would have been a shame to let good land go to Holt Briggs." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said very quietly, "It would have been a shame." But they both knew he was not talking about the land. The rain came in the second week of September, a true soaking rain that moved in from the Gulf over 3 days, gray and steady and relentless in the best way, filling the creek and the tanks and laying itself into the dry ground until the caliche loosened, and the first pale threads of new grass appeared in the flat pastures. The hand stood in the yard in it and did not come inside. Paco turned his face up to it and laughed aloud, a laugh of pure relief that made Maria, watching from the porch, feel a warmth spread through her chest that was partly joy for the land and partly something more personal and harder to name. Andrew was with the herd when the rain started. He came back at midday soaked through and tracking mud across the porch, and when he came inside and found Maria at the table, he stopped in the doorway with water running off his hat brim, and he was smiling, actually fully smiling, and it transformed his face so completely that she sat very still for a moment. He said, "The east tank is filling." She said, "I can hear it." He said, "The cattle are drinking." She said, "Good." He came fully inside and took off his hat and ran a hand through his wet hair and sat down, and he was still smiling, and she bent her head over her papers and was grateful that the room was dim enough that whatever was happening in her face was not fully visible. He said, "Maria." She looked up. He almost never used her given name. He called her Mrs. Vaughn habitually, with a formality that she had assumed was simply his manner. He said, still with that different, open quality in his face, "When the note is settled in the spring, I want to rebuild the south pasture fencing. I found a section last week that's been let go. I want to do it right." She said, "I can run the numbers." He said, "I know you can." He looked at her for a moment. He said, "I don't know what I would have come back to." She said carefully, "You would have managed." He said, "Maybe, but not like this." He gestured at the ledger, at the papers, at the tidy logic of everything she had built and maintained. He said, "Not like this." She said, "Andrew." It was the first time she had used his given name, and she heard it leave her mouth and did not quite know what to do with having said it. He looked at her with very steady eyes. She said, "It was something worth doing. It gave me a purpose when I needed one. I am glad it helped your ranch." It was quiet for a long moment. The rain came down outside, steady and healing. He said, "Is it only the ranch you are glad to have helped?" She met his eyes. Her heart was doing something complicated, and she was a woman who was not accustomed to complications in herself. She had always been the steady one, the one who kept the numbers and managed the margin and did not let things get away from her. But this was getting away from her. Or rather, it was not getting away from her. It was arriving. It was something she had been keeping in the back of the ledger, unrecorded, until the balance came due. She said, "No, it is not only the ranch." He let out a slow breath. He said, "I have been trying to figure out how to say something to you for 3 weeks." She said, "You are a slow man with words." He said, "I am a slow man with some things. I am not slow when I am certain." She said, "Are you certain?" He said, "I have been certain since about the 3rd evening when you corrected my arithmetic and did not bother to be gentle about it." She felt laughter coming and held it back because she was not ready to laugh yet, not quite. She said, "You had the column wrong." He said, "I did. And you told me so without a moment's hesitation, and I thought, this is a remarkable woman." He paused. He said, "I think it every day since." She looked at him. The rain was loud on the roof, and the room smelled of wet earth and coffee and the distant hint of the sage that grew along the creek. And she was sitting at a table she had been sitting at every day for 7 months, and it felt in this moment like a completely different place. She said, "You do not know me very well. Not yet." He said, "I know you better than you think. I have been reading your handwriting for 2 months. A person's handwriting tells you things." She said, "What does mine tell you?" He said, "That you are precise, and you are honest, and you take care with things you value. That you do not waste space on what does not matter. That you have the patience to do a thing completely or not at all." A pause. "And that you have very good taste in bookmarks." She blinked. He was smiling again, that full smile, and she realized he had been in the Tennyson on the shelf where she had tucked a small dried wildflower between pages weeks ago, not thinking about it. She said, "That is hardly a basis for a conclusion about a person." He said, "No, but it is a start." He leaned forward slightly, both arms on the table, and his voice went quieter. He said, "I am not asking you for anything you are not willing to give. I want that to be clear. You have held this place together, and I know what that is worth, and I would not muddy it with something you did not want." She said, "Andrew." He stopped. She said, "I am not a woman who is uncertain about what she wants." He looked at her. She said, "I am a woman who has been very deliberate about not wanting things she had no right to want. That is different." He said very quietly, "And now," she said, "now I am looking at what is in front of me." He reached across the table and put his hand over hers, just that. Just his hand over hers, large and warm and still, and it was the simplest gesture and the most significant one. And she turned her hand under his until their fingers interlaced, and she let herself feel it. Outside the rain came down, and the tanks filled, and the grass started growing again. And inside the main house of the Slater ranch, Andrew Slater and Maria Vaughn sat with their hands clasped across a ledger that told the full, honest story of something that had been saved. The weeks that followed were the sweetest kind of complicated, the kind that comes when two careful people allow themselves to be less careful with each other. They were not young or impulsive. They were both people who had known loss and work, and the way a hard year can hollow you out if you are not careful. And so what grew between them grew at the pace of something they both tended deliberately rather than something that simply happened to them. It was, Maria thought on a clear October morning, riding out to the east pasture on her mule while Andrew rode the bay beside her, the way crops grow, slowly, with attention, toward the light. He was a man of actions more than words, but she had learned to read his actions as clearly as she read the ledger. He repaired the step on the cabin porch that had been loose for 6 months, doing it one afternoon without mentioning it and without expecting comment. He brought her a length of blue-gray muslin from the Red Fork store when he went in for supplies, carrying it back wrapped in brown paper and setting it on the table without ceremony, saying only that he had thought she might need it for something. She made it into a shirtwaist, wearing it the following Sunday, and when she came out of the cabin he looked at her for a long moment and said, "The color suits you," in a tone that was more complicated than the words. She began bringing him coffee in the evenings when the lamp was lit and the accounts were spread between them, sliding his cup to his side of the table with a quiet domestic ease that had arrived without being decided upon. They worked side by side in the evenings, she on the books and he on the correspondence for the coming cattle season, the sounds of pen and paper and the fire and the wind outside weaving together into something that felt to her like the closest thing to peace she had known in 2 years. He told her, one October evening when the first true chill was in the air and she had her shawl around her shoulders, that he intended to ask her something when he felt he could do it properly, and that he was aware he had not yet built up the ground to make it proper. She looked at him across the lamplight and said that she appreciated the honesty more than most men's elaborate performances, and he said, with that almost smile, that he was glad because elaborate performances were not in his nature, and she said she had noticed. Caleb and Russ and Paco were not blind, of course. Cowboys see everything that happens on the land they work and process it with a thoroughness that would impress any telegraph operator. Caleb, who was 45 and had been on the range since before the war, said nothing, but began directing small logistical courtesies Andrew's way that created natural occasions for him to be near the main house in the evenings. Russ, who was younger and more direct, told Maria one afternoon while she was hanging washing and he was passing by with a saddle over his shoulder, "It is good to see the boss smiling, ma'am," and walked on. Paco, whose dark eyes observed everything without comment, simply began timing his afternoon water runs so that both horses came back to the hitching post at the same time, creating the natural opportunity of walking back to the house together that young men in any era instinctively manufacture. She appreciated all of it without acknowledging any of it directly, because that was the way of things on a working ranch, a delicacy that was the frontier's substitute for ballroom manners. The first hard frost came in early November, and Andrew cleared the frost from the water troughs before first light and brought in extra hay for the cattle and spent 2 days riding the fence line to check for weak spots before the winter pushed at it. Maria put up the last of the garden, what there was of it in a drought year, and she and Paco spent a morning banking the base of the main house with straw against the cold. She kept the books through it all, the costs of winter feed, the wages, the payments, the planning for the spring. The spring was going to be different. The rain had continued through October, not the dramatic excess that causes floods, but the steady, reliable kind that fills aquifers and coaxes grass up from roots that have been waiting all summer in the dry dark. The creek ran again, clear and shallow, and the east tank held 8 feet of water and the cattle were recovering their condition, and Andrew had sold the recovered herd to a buyer in late October at prices that were not spectacular but were honest, and the books for the first time in a year showed a forward margin that allowed for planning rather than just survival. He asked her on a Thursday morning in November. He had not built elaborate circumstances around it. He had simply come in from the early morning yard work earlier than usual, and she had been at the table, and he had sat across from her and put his hat down beside him and looked at her directly and asked. He said, "Maria, I am asking you to marry me. I know it is not a fashionable proposal, and I am not a fashionable man. This land is what I have, and it is good land. The work is hard. You know that better than anyone, but I want you here. Not as a housekeeper or a bookkeeper or a widow in a cabin at the edge of someone else's property. Here, as my wife, as the woman this place belongs to as much as it belongs to me." She looked at him. His hands were on the table in front of him, open in the particular posture of a man who is not holding anything back. She said, "You know that I cannot promise to be biddable." He said, "I know that. I am counting on it," she said, "and I will continue to correct your arithmetic." He said, "I would consider it a personal favor." She said, "Yes, then." Something in his face that had been held tense through the whole of the speech released, and he smiled, not the almost smile but the full one, the one that she had been cataloging since the first time it appeared when the rain came in September. He took her hand across the table. She let him hold it. She thought about Thomas because she was a woman of fidelity and the thought of him belonged here in this moment. She thought about his quiet, steady decency and the way the fever had taken him before they had really had time to know each other fully, and she wished him peace and release from her memory, a release that was not forgetting but was allowing the living to go on living. She was 30 years old. The land outside the window was recovering. The books balanced. And Andrew Slater was holding her hand across a ledger that told the story of what a woman could do when no one was watching. She thought that was probably enough. The wedding was performed in the Red Fork Church the first week of December, a small cold ceremony with Caleb and Russ and Paco as witnesses, and the Reverend McAdams reading the service in his careful, unhurried way. Maria wore the blue-gray muslin over a white collar she had made from a remnant of fine linen, and Andrew wore his good coat that had been hanging in the wardrobe and was only slightly too large through the shoulders because he had lost weight on the drives. Paco brought wildflowers from somewhere, dried and tied with a strip of rawhide, and pressed them into Maria's hands before the service with the earnest formality of a young man doing his best, and she was moved by it more than she showed. There was a small supper after at the ranch, with enough food that Maria had been planning it for 2 weeks, and Caleb played the fiddle and Russ sang in a voice that was better than anyone expected, and the cold December air came through the gap in the window that still needed proper caulking and made the candles gutter, and it was warm inside, and outside the sky was clear and enormous, and the stars were the particular brilliant white that they get in West Texas in winter, as if the cold has polished them. Andrew was quieter than usual that evening, not with constraint but with the kind of contained fullness that comes when a man has received something he had not been sure he would ever have. Maria watched him across the table and felt something settle in her, deep and permanent, the way a cornerstone settles. When the hands had retired to the bunkhouse and the supper things were cleared, Andrew took her hands and looked at her in the lamplight and said simply, "Thank you," she said. "For what specifically?" He said, "For being the kind of woman you are," she said. "I am only the kind of woman I am." He said, "I know, that's what I'm thanking you for." She shook her head at him fondly and blew out the lamp, and the house was dark and warm and theirs. The winter settled around the ranch with the particular peaceful austerity of the West Texas plains in cold months. The days were short and the work was quieter, the maintenance kind, the internal kind, the kind where you repair and plan and build toward the spring. Maria kept the books with the added interest of now planning 2 seasons ahead, because with the drought broken and the bank note manageable and Andrew's income from the autumn sale, there were real choices to make about the spring cattle buying and the eastern pasture's future use. They talked about it at the table by the fire in the evenings, heads bent over survey maps and supply catalogs, and the ledger that was filling with the hopeful figures of a ranch moving forward rather than barely holding still. She learned the land more deeply through these conversations, the particular challenges of the Pecos country, the way the summer heat created problems that required different solutions from other regions, the grazing rotation Andrew had developed over 8 years of watching what the land could sustain. He learned from her the kind of careful financial thinking that accounted for risk in the detailed, documented way that her father had taught her, so that decisions were made with the evidence written down, available to look back on, possible to learn from. They were, she came to understand, genuinely well matched. Not in the theatrical, breathless way of romantic stories, but in the deep practical way of two people whose particular strengths filled each other's particular gaps so naturally that the resulting whole was better than either part alone. She had the precision and the financial rigor. He had the land knowledge and the understanding of cattle and weather and the physical demands of running a working ranch. She brought patience and method. He brought steadiness and the kind of quiet courage that does not need an audience. They disagreed about things regularly. The fence repair project for the spring became an extended debate over priorities and costs that went on for 3 evenings, and was eventually resolved by Maria producing a schedule that Andrew studied for 10 minutes, and then declared, with an expression halfway between surrender and appreciation, to be correct. He disagreed with her assessment of a cattle buyer who came through in January, thinking the man trustworthy while she found something off-kilter in his paperwork, and her instinct proved correct when the buyer was later reported to have passed bad notes to another seller down the county. He did not press her on how she had known, and she did not elaborate, and they both filed the lesson. Holt Briggs did not come back. In January, they heard from the Red Fork postmaster that Briggs had turned his speculating attention to a property east of the county, some bankrupt homestead in the more settled country, and Maria felt the release of him from the ranch's story, with a satisfaction she did not bother to understate. February brought the first signs that the drought was truly behind them, new grass pushing up in the flat pastures in the second week, a pale tentative green against the tan caliche, and Andrew came in from the morning ride with a piece of it in his hand and held it out to her without speaking. She took it. It was thin and tender, the kind of green that is also a question, and it was the most hopeful thing she had held since the day she had balanced the March bank note and known the eastern pasture was saved. She pressed it between 2 pages of the ledger, on the page that recorded January of 1878 and the state of things when she had first opened the books and understood what was needed. It seemed right to put it there. Paco turned 20 in February, and Maria baked him a cake with the last of the good sugar, and the hands ate it at the supper table with a ceremony that was understated and therefore completely sincere. And Paco thanked her in Spanish and then in English, his young face open with the surprise of being celebrated, and Andrew shook his hand and told him he was the best vaquero on the Pecos, and Paco walked around for the rest of the day with his chin up. She found out she was carrying a child in March. She knew before she was certain, in the way women do, that particular physical knowledge that announces itself before the evidence is complete, and she sat with it for several days in the private part of herself before she was ready to speak. She was 30 years old, and she had not been pregnant in the 4 years of her marriage to Thomas, and she had quietly made her peace with the possibility that children might not come. And so what she felt now was not the straightforward, unambiguous joy of expectation, but something more layered, deeper, threaded through with the awareness of time and loss, and the particular gift of an unexpected second chance. She told Andrew on a Sunday morning when the light was coming in clear through the kitchen window and they had finished breakfast and the day was not yet fully engaged with its demands. She said, "I have something to tell you." He put down his coffee cup and looked at her with the immediate alertness of a man who has learned to pay attention when she says something like that. She said, "We are going to have a child." His face went through several things in quick succession. surprise, deep and genuine. Something rushing and undefended, and then something so steady and warm that it made her throat tighten. He rose from his chair and came to where she was sitting and crouched down beside her chair and took both her hands and looked at her, really looked at her and said, "Are you well?" She said, "I am very well." He said, "Are you happy?" She looked at him, at his face that was open in a way she rarely saw it, all the careful frontier containment set aside. She said, "Yes, I am very happy." He was quiet for a moment, his hands holding hers, and then he said very quietly, "I did not let myself hope for this." She said, "Nor did I," he said. "I will take care of you." She said, "I know that." He said, "I mean it in every way there is." She said, "I know that too." He kissed her hands then, both of them, and it was not the most articulate declaration a man had ever made, but it was the fullest one she had received, and she held it like good news in a dry year. The spring of 1879 came in earnest, and it was, all of them agreed, the kind of spring that the land gives you after it has been hard so that you remember why you stayed. The grass came thick in the eastern pasture, and the creek ran full and clear. The cattle recovered their weight, and the new calves were strong and plentiful. The fence work Andrew had planned went up in April and May, Caleb and Russ and Paco working the line while Andrew oversaw the stretching and setting, and it was solid work that would stand for years. Maria rode the property less as the spring advanced, and the pregnancy grew present in her body, but she kept the books with the same regularity, sitting at the window table each morning with the ledger and her pen, and the increasingly satisfying columns of figures that showed a ranch in recovery. She organized the spring cattle sale with Andrew, corresponding with 3 buyers and securing a fair price for 40 head, a price that, entered in the ledger, made the balance for the spring look better than any quarter since she had begun keeping the records. She also wrote letters, 2 of them. One was to the bank in Comanche Falls, advising them of the coming full settlement of the bank note on the eastern pasture. The second was to the feed supplier in Comanche Falls, the man who had agreed to the installment plan in January of the previous year, informing him that the account was settled in full and thanking him for his good faith. She felt something deep and clean when she sealed that second letter, the completion of something she had begun in a cold January alone with a failing ledger and a ranch she had no formal claim to and chose to care for anyway. Andrew read both letters before she sent them, and when he read the one to the feed supplier, he sat with it for a long moment and then he said, "That is generously written." She said, "He was an honest man to deal with in a hard time. That deserves acknowledging." He said, "You think about that, the people behind the transactions." She said, "Don't you?" He said, "I do. I was noting that you do." She met his eyes, and the current of complete understanding that moved between them sometimes, quick and clear as the creek in spring, moved. Paco found a situation in the late spring that required more attention than any of them had expected. He came to the house one May evening looking troubled, and when Andrew asked him what was on his mind, Paco explained, carefully, and with the particular dignity of a young man choosing his words in a language not native to him, that he had been stopped on the Red Fork Road by the county deputy and questioned without cause, held for several hours, and told in language that left no ambiguity about its contempt that his presence in Crockett County was unwelcome. He had not been charged with anything because there was nothing to charge him with, but the experience had shaken him, and he had been turning it over for 2 days before he spoke. Andrew's face was still when he heard this, still in the way of contained anger rather than indifference. He said, "You did nothing." Paco said, "Nothing." Andrew said, "I know." He went to Red Fork the following day. Maria did not ask what was said between him and the deputy, but when he returned, he told her that the matter had been addressed, that the sheriff above the deputy had been spoken to, and that Paco was to have no further difficulty on the Red Fork Road. He said it simply as a factual matter that had been handled. He did not perform it. But Maria saw the quality of his attention to it, the way he had not let it rest, and she loved him for it in the specific, deliberate way she loved the particular things about him that told her who he was. She said, "It is still a hard thing to be him in this country." Andrew said, "Yes," a pause. "It is not right," she said. "No," he said, "it is what this country is in too many places. That does not make it right." She said, "No, it does not." They sat with that for a moment, the acknowledgement of something that neither of them could fully resolve, but that both of them saw clearly, and then she put her hand over his and they were quiet together, which was sometimes the most honest response available. Pecos stayed. He was offered wages that reflected his 5 years of skilled and faithful work, a rate that Maria had calculated and proposed, and Andrew had agreed to immediately without the negotiation she had half expected. Paco accepted with the same quiet dignity with which he did everything, and rode out the next morning on his good horse in the early light, and Maria thought that some things on the frontier were as unjust as the drought, and that the only honorable response was to do better within the circle of what you controlled, even when the larger circle remained wrong. The summer was warm but not killing, nothing like the drought summer. The cattle were healthy, and the water held, and the work was steady and manageable. Maria moved through her days with the careful attention of a woman in her later pregnancy, doing the indoor work and the bookkeeping and the correspondence, but letting the men take the outdoor weight, which they did without being asked, and without diminishing her with excessive solicitude. Andrew was attentive without being smothering, which was the exact balance she needed, and which he seemed to understand intuitively. He came in for the midday meal without fail, which he had not always done before, and he made sure the water barrel in the kitchen was always full, and he came to the table in the evenings with a kind of deliberate presence, as if he were making a point of being there. In the evenings when the heat had eased, and the sky turned the colors that West Texas specializes in, the ochres and deep roses, and the particular purple that comes just before full dark, they would sit on the porch, he in the wide chair and she beside him in the rocker that Caleb had built for her back in February without being asked, and they would sit in the cool air and talk or not talk, and it was the best part of the day. He told her, on one of those evenings in July, that he had been lonely for a very long time without quite knowing it. He said it without self-pity, just as a fact about his life that he was now able to see from the other side of it. He said he had thought the loneliness was just the condition of the work, the nature of the frontier, the price of building something on land that took most of what you had. He said he had not understood until she was there that the loneliness was not about the work or the land but about the absence of someone to do it with. She said, "I know what that is." He said, "I know you do." She said, "It is different now." He said, "Yes," she said, "considerably." He looked at her with that full smile in the evening light, and she smiled back and reached over and took his hand, and they sat on the porch of the house that had been saved and watched the sky go dark. The baby came in October. He was born on a Wednesday morning, strong-voiced and vigorous, after a labor that was hard but not complicated, attended by the midwife from Red Fork, a capable woman named Mrs. Crow who had delivered most of the county and treated the business of birth with the brisk, matter-of-fact competence that Maria deeply appreciated. Andrew was in the front room during the labor and she could hear him, the measured sound of his boots on the floorboards, and it made her feel, even through the difficulty of the work of it, less alone. When the baby came and Mrs. Crow carried him to the doorway and told Andrew he had a son, there was a silence, and then a single low sound from the front room that she recognized as Andrew Slater stripped of his considerable composure, and she lay back on the pillow and felt more tired and more glad than she had ever been in her life. He came in, and he was not composed at all, not one bit, and she had not seen that before, and she would not forget it. He sat carefully on the edge of the bed and she put the baby in his arms, showing him how to hold the weight of a newborn, and he held his son with the extreme concentrated care of a man handling the most important thing he had ever been trusted with, and he looked at the small red wrinkled face and said, in a voice that was not quite steady, "He is perfect," she said. He is very loud. Andrew made a sound that was a laugh and a breath in the same syllable. He looked at her. His eyes were bright with something that made her chest ache with tenderness. He said, "What do you want to call him?" she said. "I have been thinking Thomas for my husband, and James for your father." Thomas James Slater. He looked at her for a long moment. He said, "That is a good name." She said, "I thought so." He said, "Thomas James." He said it again quietly to the baby, and the baby curled his fist against his father's chest and was briefly quiet. Caleb and Russ and Paco came to see the baby that afternoon, removing their hats at the bedroom door and standing in a row with the awkward solemnity of men performing a ceremony whose protocol they were uncertain of. Caleb said the boy had good lungs, which was a high practical compliment on a working ranch. Russ said he reckoned the boy would be a fine hand someday, which was the finest thing Russ knew how to say. Paco looked at the baby in Maria's arms with an expression of open, uncomplicated wonder and said, in Spanish, a word she knew meant something like blessing, and she thanked him in Spanish, and he ducked his head and went back to his work. That evening, with Thomas James sleeping in the cradle that Andrew had built in July from good pine and sanded smooth, Maria sat up against her pillow and asked Andrew for the ledger. He looked at her. She said, "I want to record it." He brought it to her and the ink and the pen, and she opened it to the current page and wrote in her neat, slanted hand the date and the fact. Thomas James Slater, born this day, October 14, 1879, to Andrew and Maria Slater in Crockett County, West Texas. Good health, clear sky. Ranch in order. She showed it to Andrew. He read it and said, "In the accounts," she said. "Everything worth keeping goes in the accounts." He sat down beside her on the bed and looked at the page for a long moment. He said, "When I came home and found you there, keeping the books, saving the ranch, a woman I had never met who knew everything about this place and nothing about me, I did not know what to think." She said, "You asked me who I was." He said, "I did," she said, "and now you know." He said, "And now I know." He took the ledger gently from her hands and set it on the table beside the bed, and turned and looked at her in the lamplight. This woman who had walked into the failing heart of his life, and held it steady without being asked, and asked nothing in return. This woman who had turned his absence into a story of faithfulness and competence and quiet, unwitnessed courage. He said, "I think I know better than anyone alive." She looked at him and thought about the morning in January of the year before when she had sat down at a table that was not hers, in a house she did not own, with a ledger she had not been asked to tend, and had picked up the pen and begun. She had done it because it was the right thing, and because she was capable of it, and because there was work that needed doing and no one else to do it. She had not done it for reward or recognition, or because she expected any particular outcome. But she was glad, in the deep, complete way of a life that has arrived somewhere it did not know it was going, that this was where the numbers had come out. The ranch entered the winter of 1879 with full water tanks and a healthy herd and a banknote cleared, and a new son asleep in a cradle by the fire. And the books were balanced to the last cent, and the grass would come again in the spring. And Andrew Slater and Maria Vaughn Slater sat at the wide-planked table in the lamplight after the baby had been fed and the hands had settled for the night, and they worked at the plans for the coming year. Side by side in the easy, competent silence of two people who have found the right place to put their particular kind of love, which was not the breathless kind, or not only that, but the kind that shows up every morning and does the work and stays. The following spring brought the expansion they had been planning, a new section of fence on the northern boundary that opened another 200 acres of good grazing, a deal with a cattle buyer out of San Angelo who turned out to be an honest man and a reliable market for years afterward, and a second letter to the bank, this one not about notes or payments, but about the possibility of a modest expansion loan for a new stock building Andrew wanted to build on the east side of the yard. The banker, a man named Porter who had been watching the Slater account with increasing respect over the past year and a half, granted the loan without negotiation. Maria made a note of it in the ledger with a sense of satisfaction that was partly professional and partly personal, and mostly the satisfaction of someone who had done a thing right and seen it carry forward. Paco, in the spring of 1880, told Andrew he had saved enough to put a deposit on a small parcel east of the Slater land, a dry but manageable piece that could support a small herd. He was 21 years old and had been planning this for 2 years, and the way he told it, quietly and with that contained dignity, made Andrew shake his hand and Maria squeeze his arm and Caleb slap him on the back hard enough to stagger him, which was Caleb's highest expression of approval. Paco remained as a paid hand through the building season, helping with the stock building, and when he finally moved onto his own land in the autumn of 1880, he was close enough that he rode over on Sundays, and the connection did not end. It simply changed. Caleb stayed for another 4 years before his knees told him the outdoor work was finished, and Andrew helped him settle in a rooming house in Red Fork where he lived comfortably on the savings he had accumulated over 2 decades of cowboy work. Russ married a woman from the Comanche Falls country in 1880 and brought her to the ranch, and they built a small house on the western edge of the property, and he remained a Slater hand for the better part of a decade. Thomas James Slater grew in the way of ranch children, fast and curious and physically capable, riding before he was 4 on the broad back of the old mule, and following his father around the yard with a miniature version of focused attention that made the hands grin. He could not yet add, but he showed an interest in the ledger that made Maria watch him with a private smile, because he climbed up onto the bench beside her and looked at the pages with the particular absorption of someone to whom numbers are a language he is beginning to hear. In the summer of 1882, a second child arrived, a girl this time, born on a hot August morning with the same clear voice and vigorous constitution as her brother. They named her Ellen Rose, for Andrew's mother, whose name he had not spoken aloud in years and whose memory he carried in the way of a man who has been far from home too long. When he said the name Ellen, quietly over the sleeping newborn, Maria heard the years in it and held his hand. Ellen Rose Slater was born into a ranch that was fully itself, steady and solvent and working, the kind of place that exists in the space between surviving and thriving, which is where most good things live. She grew up knowing the ledger as well as her brother did, but where Thomas was drawn to the outdoor work and the cattle the way his father was, Ellen had her mother's eyes for figures and her grandmother's name, and the same steady brown gaze that had held things together during a drought that had tried to undo everything. The story of how Maria Vaughn had kept the Slater Ranch books through the worst drought in a decade, alone and unasked, and without a word to anyone, became one of those stories that a county tells about itself. It was not a grand story. It had no villains defeated in dramatic fashion, no great heroic gesture, no single luminous moment of rescue. It was the story of daily competence and faithfulness, and the quiet refusal to let good things fail for want of attention. It was told at supper tables and over fences, and in the Red Fork General Store, with the satisfaction that people take in a story that reflects well on the kind of character they would like to see in the world. Maria never told it herself. She did not need to. The ledger told it line by line in her clear and careful hand. On a September evening in 1882, the anniversary of nothing in particular but the right kind of evening anyway, she and Andrew sat on the porch in the cooling air with the sounds of the 2 children inside the house and the dogs settled at their feet and the first stars coming out over the flat land. The grass was good this year. The cattle were fat. The water was right. The books balanced to the penny and showed a ranch that had been earned, not given, and was continuing to grow in the careful, deliberate way of things that are built to last. Andrew said, "I have been thinking about the north fence again," she said. "I ran those numbers last week," he said, "and," she said, "spring would be better after the April sale." He nodded. The evening settled around them. He put his arm around her shoulders and she leaned into him, and they sat together on the porch of the house they had made out of hard seasons and good numbers, and the particular kind of love that is not about arrival but about staying. And the sky above the high desert deepened to the blue-black that she had come to know as her sky, the sky above her own place. And it was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything that keeping the books had been the beginning of. Recorded in the permanent ink of a life that had balanced out well in the end.